The Void Awakens. Commander Sarah Chen pressed her face against the observation deck window of the research vessel Prometheus, watching stars flicker like dying candles in the cosmic wind. Something was wrong with the universe itself, and she could feel it in her bones. The ship drifted silently through the outer rim territories, where space seemed thicker somehow, as if reality had grown tired. 3 weeks ago, deep space monitoring stations had detected what scientists called probability storms rippling through the fabric of space-time. These weren't natural phenomena. The energy signatures defied every law of physics humanity had discovered in their 5 centuries among the stars. Dr. Michael Torres, the ship's chief physicist, had spent sleepless nights staring at readings that made no sense. Matter was behaving like energy, time flowed backward in some sectors, and in others, the fundamental constants that held atoms together simply stopped working. The Prometheus carried a crew of 68 humans, all volunteers who had signed up for what everyone assumed would be a routine scientific mission. None of them expected to witness the beginning of the end. Sarah's communication officer, Lieutenant James Park, suddenly straightened at his station. His face had gone pale as moonlight. The familiar hum of incoming transmissions filled the bridge, but these weren't the usual traffic reports or supply requests. These were emergency broadcasts from across the galaxy, all saying the same impossible thing. The Zephyrians, ancient beings of pure thought, who had existed since the galaxy was young, were abandoning their crystal cities. The Corvani Empire, whose warrior fleets had conquered 1,000 worlds, was retreating to the darkest corners of space. The peaceful Meridian Collective, known throughout the galaxy for their wisdom and calm nature, were fleeing in ships so overloaded with refugees that many were breaking apart under the strain. Every major civilization, every minor colony, every spacefaring species in the galaxy was running from something that made them forget their pride, their territories, and their ancient feuds. Sarah activated the ship's main communication array and opened a channel to Galactic Council Station, the massive structure that orbited the galaxy's center and served as the meeting place for all civilized species. What she saw when the connection established made her heart skip several beats. The station's great assembly hall, which normally buzzed with the voices of hundreds of different species conducting business, was nearly empty. Only a handful of beings remained, and they all shared the same expression of absolute terror. Ambassador Thekkwar of the Corvani floated in his containment sphere, his usual commanding presence replaced by something Sarah had never seen in a Corvani warrior before. Fear, his voice, normally strong enough to shake mountains, came through the speakers as barely more than a whisper. The warrior's 4 arms trembled as he spoke, and his eyes, usually bright with the fire of conquest, had gone dark with dread. The entity they were fleeing from had no name in any known language. The few survivors who had encountered it could only describe it as the Silence, because wherever it passed, the universe itself stopped making noise. Stars didn't just go out. They forgot how to shine. Planets didn't just die. They forgot how to exist. The Silence moved through space like a living shadow, consuming not just matter and energy, but the very rules that allowed matter and energy to exist in the first place. Dr. Torres listened to the reports with growing horror. The entity seemed to operate outside normal spacetime, existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. When it focused its attention on a star system, the laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolute rules. Gravity might flow upward, light could cast shadows, and time occasionally ran in circles. Most terrifying of all, thinking beings seemed to attract its attention. The more complex a civilization's thoughts, the more likely the Silence was to notice them. Ambassador Veltar of the Meridian Collective, whose species had survived the death of 3 previous galaxies, stood before the assembly with tears streaming down her crystalline face. Her people, she explained, had encountered the Silence before, in their original home galaxy billions of years ago. They had watched it consume everything they had ever known, every world they had built, every thought they had ever thought. The Meridians had fled then. as they were fleeing now, because fighting the silence was not just impossible, it was meaningless. How do you fight something that can simply decide that your weapons don't work, that your ships don't exist, that you were never born? The few remaining species representatives began their final exodus preparations. The great ships that had carried civilizations across the void between galaxies were being prepared for another journey, this time to the neighboring Andromeda galaxy, 2.5 million light-years away. It would be a one-way trip that would take thousands of years, but it was better than facing the silence. Sarah watched in amazement as species that had been enemies for millennia worked together in their shared terror. Corvini battle cruisers protected Meridian refugee ships. Zephyrian fought vessels shared navigation data with primitive Turrican colony ships. In the face of ultimate extinction, old hatreds seemed petty and meaningless. But as each species announced their departure plans, Sarah realized with growing certainty that humanity would not be joining the Exodus. She opened a secure channel to Earth's Interstellar Command. Admiral Rebecca Harrison's weathered face appeared on the screen, and Sarah could see the weight of impossible decisions in the older woman's eyes. Behind the Admiral, through the windows of the orbital command station, Earth hung like a blue jewel against the starfield. It looked peaceful, unaware that the universe itself was under attack. The Admiral listened to Sarah's report in silence, occasionally asking for clarification on technical details that even their best scientists couldn't fully understand. When Sarah finished, Admiral Harrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at reports from human colonies scattered across hundreds of light years. Finally, she spoke with the kind of calm authority that had carried humanity from a single world to the stars. Humanity, the Admiral announced, would not be evacuating. They would not abandon their worlds, their colonies, or their place in the galaxy. Every other species might choose to run, but humans had a different response to impossible odds. They would stay, they would study the silence, and they would find a way to fight back. It wasn't arrogance, the Admiral explained. It was simply what humans did when faced with extinction. They adapted, they innovated, and they refused to give up. The news spread through human space with incredible speed. On farming colonies at the galaxy's edge, families gathered around communication screens to hear their government's decision. In the asteroid mining belts, workers paused in their dangerous jobs to listen to broadcasts from Earth. On research stations studying alien artifacts, scientists looked up from their work to contemplate what fighting an impossible enemy might mean. The response was not what anyone expected. Instead of panic, there was determination. Instead of fear, there was curiosity. Humans across the galaxy began asking the same question. If the silence could rewrite the laws of physics, could humans learn to rewrite them back? If this entity existed outside normal reality, could human ingenuity find a way to force it to play by the universe's rules? The farming colonies began converting their atmospheric processors into reality stabilization devices. The mining operations started producing materials for experimental weapons. The research stations turned their attention to understanding how consciousness itself might be used as a tool for survival. Dr. Torres made the first breakthrough 3 days after the alien exodus began. While studying quantum field fluctuations around areas where the silence had been active, he discovered something extraordinary. The entity wasn't actually changing the laws of physics. Instead, it was imposing a different set of physical laws, ones that came from whatever reality it originally inhabited. This meant that the normal laws of physics still existed in those areas. They were simply being suppressed by the silence's presence. If they could find a way to strengthen local reality, to make the normal laws of physics more stable and resistant to outside influence, they might be able to create safe zones where the silence's power couldn't reach. It was like the difference between a loud radio station overpowering a weak signal versus 2 equally strong stations competing for the same frequency. The key was to make their reality broadcast louder than the silence. Working around the clock, teams of human scientists and engineers began developing what they called quantum reality anchors. These devices would create fields of stabilized space-time, areas where the fundamental constants of the universe were locked into their normal values and couldn't be changed by outside forces. The first prototype was built on the mining station Titan's Edge, where Chief Engineer Marcus Webb and his team had been working with exotic matter for decades. When they activated the prototype, the results were immediately visible. The mining station, which had been experiencing reality fluctuations for weeks, suddenly became stable again. Tools worked the way they were supposed to. Time flowed forward at its normal rate. Most importantly, the quantum sensors showed that the silence's influence couldn't penetrate the anchor field. They had created humanity's first line of defense against an impossible enemy. As word of the breakthrough spread, human colonies across the galaxy began building their own reality anchors. Each device required enormous amounts of power and rare materials, but humans had always been resourceful. Farming colonies used their fusion reactors to power the anchors. Mining operations provided the exotic matter needed for construction. Even passenger ships contributed by carrying components and technical experts to colonies that needed help. But the silence was not idle during humanity's preparations. Deep space monitoring stations detected massive disturbances moving through the galaxy's outer spiral arms. Entire star systems were going dark, not destroyed but fundamentally altered. Reports from automated probes showed regions of space where physics worked differently, where matter existed in states that had no names, where cause and effect had become suggestions rather than absolute rules. The entity was learning, adapting to humanity's presence in the galaxy. It had consumed hundreds of alien civilizations over the eons, each time growing stronger and more sophisticated. But it had never encountered a species that refused to flee, a people who responded to impossible threats by trying to understand and overcome them. For the first time in its vast existence, the silence was curious about its prey. The Last Stand. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in the center of Earth's most advanced physics laboratory, surrounded by machines that hummed with enough power to light a small city. The Quantum Reality Research Facility had been humanity's crown jewel of scientific achievement, but now it served a far more desperate purpose. Elena and her team were racing to understand the silence before it reached the core systems of human space, where billions of people lived and worked on hundreds of worlds. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, a young graduate student studying consciousness and quantum mechanics, made a connection that changed everything. While analyzing the patterns of the silence's movement through the galaxy, she noticed that it avoided certain types of quantum resonance frequencies. These weren't random frequencies. They matched the brainwave patterns of sentient beings during moments of intense creativity and problem-solving. Elena stared at Maria's data for hours, checking and rechecking the calculations. The implications were staggering. The silence wasn't just attracted to thinking minds. It was repelled by certain types of thoughts. Specifically, it seemed unable to function properly in areas where conscious beings were actively engaged in creative problem-solving, innovation, and collaborative thinking. It was as if the entity, which existed by imposing its own reality on the universe, couldn't maintain control when faced with minds that were constantly generating new possibilities and solutions. This discovery led to the development of what humans began calling consciousness amplification fields. By linking human minds through quantum communication networks and encouraging them to engage in collaborative creative thinking, they could create areas of space where the silence's power was significantly weakened. It wasn't enough to stop the entity entirely, but it provided the foundation for humanity's ultimate defense strategy. Captain Alex Rodriguez commanded the defense fleet stationed at the edge of the Sol system, humanity's birthplace and the heart of human civilization. His ships were unlike anything that had ever been built before. Each vessel was equipped with both reality anchors and consciousness amplification systems. The crews were trained not just in traditional military tactics, but in collaborative problem-solving techniques that could turn their combined thinking into a weapon against an enemy that existed outside normal reality. The fleet included converted colony ships from the outer settlements, hastily armed mining vessels from the asteroid belts, and even passenger liners that had been transformed into mobile command centers. Every human in the system, from children in schools to elderly residents in care facilities, was connected to the amplification network. When the Silence finally arrived at humanity's doorstep, it would face not just weapons and shields, but the combined creative potential of an entire species. The first contact came without warning. Deep space sensors detected a disturbance near Neptune, where reality itself began to fluctuate like a mirage in the desert. The gas giant's storms, which had raged for centuries, suddenly stopped moving. Its moons began orbiting in perfect squares instead of ellipses. Most disturbing of all, the space around Neptune started broadcasting signals in languages that had never existed, mathematical equations that solved problems no one had asked. Captain Rodriguez ordered his fleet to the outer system, knowing that this would be humanity's only chance to test their theories under combat conditions. As his ships approached Neptune, they activated both their reality anchors and consciousness amplification systems. The result was immediate and dramatic. The impossible geometry around the planet began to shift back toward normal. The square orbits became elliptical again. The phantom signals faded into silence. But the silence was learning from this encounter. As humanity's defenses pushed against its influence, the entity began to adapt its approach. Instead of trying to overpower the reality anchors directly, it started probing for weaknesses in the consciousness network. Some crew members began experiencing vivid hallucinations that felt more real than reality. Others found their memories changing, recalling events that had never happened or forgetting things that were crucial to their identities. Dr. Vasquez, monitoring the battle from Earth, realized that the Silence was using humanity's own consciousness network against them. By feeding false information into the amplification field, it could disrupt the creative thinking patterns that formed their primary defense. She immediately began working on countermeasures, but time was running short. The entity was moving deeper into the solar system, and with each passing hour, its influence grew stronger. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Thomas Chen, a 7-year-old boy living on Mars colony, was participating in the consciousness network through his school's education program. Unlike the adults, who were focused on complex technical solutions, Thomas approached the problem with the simple logic of a child. During one of the network sessions, he asked a question that stopped every scientist and engineer in the system. If the bad thing can only be in one place at a time, why don't we make it really confused about where it is? Dr. Vasquez immediately understood what the child meant. The Silence existed partially outside normal spacetime, but it still had to focus its attention on specific locations to exert its influence. If they could create multiple false targets, areas that looked like major population centers or important strategic locations, they might be able to fragment the entity's attention and reduce its power at any single point. Working with unprecedented speed and cooperation, human colonies across the solar system began implementing what became known as the Mirror Protocol. Each populated world created dozens of false quantum signatures that mimicked the patterns of major cities and industrial centers. Space stations broadcast fake consciousness signals that suggested millions of thinking beings where only automated systems existed. Even individual ships began generating multiple false identities, making it appear that humanity's fleet was thousands of times larger than it actually was. The effect on the Silence was immediate and startling. The entity, which had been moving steadily toward Earth, suddenly began changing direction erratically. It would start toward Mars, then veer toward the asteroid belt, then reverse course toward the outer planets. Its reality warping effects became inconsistent and localized instead of the steady, overwhelming force it had been. Captain Rodriguez seized this opportunity to launch humanity's counterattack. His fleet, coordinated through the consciousness network, began surrounding areas where the Silence's influence was strongest. Instead of trying to destroy something that might not be destroyable, they focused on containing it, using overlapping reality anchor fields to create a cage of stable spacetime around the entity. The final confrontation took place in the space between Earth and Mars, where the Silence had become trapped by humanity's reality cage. For the first time since entering the galaxy, the entity was forced to exist entirely within normal physics. It appeared on their sensors as a vast cloud of dark energy, constantly shifting and trying to escape the boundaries that humanity had created around it. Dr. Vasquez made the final discovery that would end the crisis. While studying the Silence's quantum signature within the reality cage, she realized that the entity wasn't actually malevolent in any way humans could understand. It was simply trying to return home to its own reality, a universe where different physical laws allowed it to exist naturally. The reason it consumed other civilizations wasn't out of hunger or hatred, but because it needed the quantum energy of thinking minds to power its journey between realities. This revelation changed everything. Instead of trying to destroy the Silence, humanity began working to help it find its way home. Using the same consciousness amplification technology that had been their primary defense, they created a directed quantum tunnel that connected normal spacetime to the entity's home reality. It required the combined mental effort of every human in the solar system, focusing their creative thinking on the single goal of opening a doorway between universes. The process took 17 hours of continuous effort. Children fell asleep while still connected to the network, their dreams adding strange but crucial elements to the quantum tunnel. Scientists worked past exhaustion, their fatigue-clouded thoughts providing unexpected solutions to problems they couldn't solve while fully alert. Artists and musicians contributed patterns of creativity that gave the tunnel its final stability. Even people who had never considered themselves particularly intelligent or creative found that their unique perspectives were essential pieces of the puzzle. When the tunnel finally opened, the Silence paused in its endless shifting and seemed almost to sigh with relief. The entity began moving toward the dimensional gateway, its reality warping effects fading as it prepared to leave normal spacetime behind. But before it departed, something unprecedented happened. For just a moment, the Silence attempted to communicate with humanity. The message came not in words or images, but in direct understanding that bypassed language entirely. The entity conveyed gratitude for humanity's help, amazement at their refusal to flee, and something that might have been respect for their ingenuity in finding a solution that helped everyone involved. It had consumed countless civilizations over the ends, but this was the first time any species had chosen to understand rather than simply resist or run away. As the Silence disappeared through the quantum tunnel back to its home reality, normal physics reasserted themselves throughout the galaxy. Stars that had forgotten how to shine began glowing again. Planets that had been twisted into impossible shapes returned to their natural forms. The fundamental constants of the universe stabilized, and spacetime itself seemed to relax with relief. News of humanity's success spread quickly to the fleeing alien civilizations. Many were skeptical at first, unable to believe that the terror they had fled from had been resolved through cooperation rather than conquest. But as their long-range sensors confirmed that the Silence's influence had vanished from the galaxy, the great Exodus fleets began to turn around and head home. The Corvani were the first to return, their warrior fleets arriving at human space with a mixture of shame and curiosity. Ambassador Thekfar, who had been among the first to flee, requested a meeting with human representatives. When Admiral Harrison met with him on Galactic Council Station, the proud warrior did something unprecedented in Corvani culture. He admitted that humans had shown courage where his people had shown fear. The Meridian Collective arrived next, their ancient ships carrying wisdom gathered from multiple galaxies and billions of years of existence. Ambassador Veltar brought with her stories of countless civilizations that had faced the Silence and failed, making humanity's success even more remarkable. The Meridians offered to share their accumulated knowledge with humanity, recognizing that a species capable of such innovative thinking deserved access to the greatest libraries in the galaxy. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the galaxy viewed humanity itself. Before the Silence Crisis, humans had been considered a young, inexperienced species with potential but little proven ability. They had been members of the Galactic Council, but not particularly influential ones. Now, suddenly, every major civilization wanted to learn from humanity's approach to impossible problems. Dr. Vasquez found herself appointed as humanity's first director of consciousness research, a position that didn't exist before, but became crucial as other species sought to understand how human creativity and determination had succeeded where traditional military might have failed. Her research into the relationship between consciousness and quantum mechanics opened new fields of study that would benefit every thinking species in the galaxy. Captain Rodriguez was promoted to admiral and given command of a joint species fleet dedicated to exploring the boundaries between realities. His ships, crewed by volunteers from dozens of different civilizations, used human-designed reality anchors and consciousness amplification systems to safely investigate phenomena that had previously been too dangerous to study. The young graduate student Maria Santos became the galaxy's leading expert on entity communication, developing protocols for peaceful contact with beings from other realities. Her work ensured that if humanity ever encountered something like the Silence again, their first response would be to try understanding and communication, rather than immediate resistance. Even 7-year-old Thomas Chen found his life changed by the crisis. His simple but crucial insight led to new educational programs that encouraged children of all species to approach complex problems with curiosity and creativity rather than fear. Schools throughout the galaxy began teaching human-style problem-solving, which emphasized collaboration, imagination, and the willingness to consider solutions that seemed impossible at first glance. As the alien fleets returned to their homeworlds and normal trade resumed throughout the galaxy, humanity discovered that their reputation had been fundamentally transformed. They were no longer seen as inexperienced newcomers, but as the species that had faced the impossible and found a way forward. Other civilizations began seeking human advice on problems they had considered unsolvable, from ancient territorial disputes to mysterious phenomena at the galaxy's edge. The crisis had taught humanity something important about themselves as well. When faced with a threat that made every other species in the galaxy flee in terror, humans had chosen to stay not because they were braver or stronger, but because they approached the unknown with curiosity rather than fear. Their first instinct had been to study and understand rather than fight or run, and that difference in perspective had made all the difference in the outcome. Years later, when historians from across the galaxy studied the Silence Crisis, they would identify it as the moment when humanity truly came of age as a galactic civilization. Not because they had conquered a great enemy, but because they had found a way to transform a crisis into an opportunity for understanding and cooperation. They had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon against the impossible is simply the willingness to believe that there might be a better solution than anyone has thought of yet. In the end, humanity's greatest victory wasn't defeating the Silence. It was showing the galaxy that there was always another way forward, even when all hope seemed lost. They had stood when others fled, not out of stubbornness or pride, but because they believed that every problem, no matter how impossible it seemed, contained within it the seeds of its own solution. All you had to do was be curious enough to look for them, creative enough to recognize them, and brave enough to try something that had never been attempted before. The galaxy was safer now, not because a great threat had been destroyed, but because its civilizations had learned a new way of facing the unknown. Together, with curiosity and hope instead of fear and desperation. And at the center of this transformation stood humanity, no longer the youngest species in the galaxy, but perhaps its wisest teachers.